First of all, one of the things that we heard in our travel was from the leadership of the country, which, as you know, represents leaders from Kurdistan, as well as Sunni and Shia leaders, with the president, the prime minister, and the Speaker of the House. And they made it a very high priority in their communication with us to communicate that they have no interest in becoming a puppet state of Iran. And that they believe that, at least in the public press, and perhaps I'm projecting on them my own reading of the public press, a sense that Iraq has fallen under the sway of Iran and will increasingly do their bidding. They instead said, no, our interest is not becoming the puppet of any nation, but is instead to become an independent and strong, stable entity. Is that an accurate assessment of what you believe is really the intent of the leadership in Iraq? Or is that just what they hope to be able to sell to traveling Americans?
Senator, thank you very much for that question. I concur. I believe that is an accurate portrayal of the genuine Iraqi leadership view on this issue. Iraq's goal is to become a sovereign, independent, unified, democratic state, and that is certainly the goal of the United States policy as well. When you look at the horrors of what has happened in the last few years in Iraq, the ravages of the institutions, both from the era of Saddam Hussein and then in the difficult fight against ISIS, the Iraqi authorities have a real desire to rebuild institutions and ensure that they have the capacity to withstand any threats, any hostile actions from any of their neighbors.
Yes, Mr. Milroy.
Yes, sir. So they said essentially the exact same thing to me in my trip in March. And I would point out that all three of those leaders you mentioned have long-standing relationships with U.S. Senior leaders for decades. And they do talk very bluntly. I would say that the July 1st proclamation by the Prime Minister is a very good step to bring them under the control of the Iraqi security forces and away from political affiliations. It's important to note that all PMF fought against ISIS. Some of them are very well thought of by the Iraqi people. Others are almost wholly controlled by the Iranians, and not only don't work for the best interests of the Iraqi people, but they have essentially turned to criminality to fund themselves even further. And they have become less and less favored by the Iraqi people. It is important, I think, that we do everything we can to help facilitate the government of Iraq bringing in the good and the disciplined PMF under the authority of the Iraqi military and disband the remainder.
One of the things we heard from the leaders there was a recognition that they share a very large border with Iran, that Iran has substantial interest in extending their influences throughout Iraq, that Iran is investing substantially in enterprises of various kinds to strengthen those ties, and they wonder why aren't other nations doing the same. Given the obvious conflict geopolitically between Iran and Saudi Arabia, I would have anticipated that Saudi Arabia would have been a very active participant in Iraq as well, that it would have been countering Iran's influence there by its own investments, by its own personnel, cultural exchanges, and so forth. But that was not what was recounted by Iraqi's leaders. Is there a reason that Saudi Arabia is not more involved and other Arab nations are not more involved with Iraq? And are there ways to encourage their greater participation there as well as more U.S. participation? Clearly, the ExxonMobil investment would have been a major connection between our nations, but are there ways we have of encouraging Saudi Arabia and others to become more involved with the Iraqi economy?
Those are all great questions, Mr. Chairman. I would note that Prime Minister, the Prime Minister's first trip outside of Iraq was to Cairo, not to Tehran. And this was a really important step because he went there to meet with heads of state from from Egypt and Jordan to further the Iraqi government's goal of further reintegration with the Arab neighbors. Iran and Iraq have a shared border, a shared history, a shared culture. A lot of the infrastructure is connected. So those are tough things to undo. But I think the fact that the Prime Minister's very first trip was to the Arab world rather than to Tehran shows that he's very committed to working to strengthen those ties. We're working very hard to support the Iraqi government's goal of becoming more sovereign, more independent. Energy independence, as you highlighted in your remarks, is a very key part of that. In addition to the various U.S. projects that we're promoting, we're also looking at ways that that Iraq could hook its infrastructure further into the GCC countries or even into Jordan. So these are very interesting ideas for Iraq to pivot west rather than east. The business climate in Iraq is challenging, and I think it's a lot easier for countries with less high standards than the United States, countries that do not have strong anti-corruption laws, to do business. But that said, we're working very closely with the Iraqi government to try to improve the business climate there. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, UNCTAD has an important project that works to improve the business environment. We've been very supportive in working with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and other business delegations, other business groups, to bring American businesses to Iraq, to establish the relationships, to get to know the environment there. Deputy Secretary Sullivan, for example, led our largest ever trade delegation to Iraq, and we continue to do that. So it's a work in progress of supporting Iraq's goal to reorient itself away from dependence on Iran in an economic sense to opening to the rest of the region.
Thank you. I'll let Mr. Mulroy respond briefly, if you will. But particular, why is Saudi Arabia not more involved there, and can we encourage that?
So to the point of your question, with the tyranny of geography when it comes to Iran, they do share a 900-mile border with Iraq, and they have $12 billion in trade, and they have extensive permanent family ties back and forth. For the U.S., we provide a lot of things that they don't. We provide the top-notch security assistance that actually is for the benefit of the government of Iraq. We also, of course, have international leadership when it comes to stabilization and economic development. Specifically to Saudi Arabia, we, under defense diplomacy, so to speak, support the State Department in its efforts to get Saudi Arabia more involved, and I think they are getting more involved. I also think they're getting more involved in some of the key components of that, which includes bringing some of the disenfranchised parts of Iraq, like the Sunni Arab tribes, into the future of Iraq. They have a unique perspective on that and capability to do that, and they have been involved with us in developing that tribal engagement program that we think is so important, so we don't do perhaps the same mistakes of the past where we've just excluded the Sunnis. I'd also point out the fact that Jordan is becoming more involved economically with our encouragement with Iraq, and I think that's very important, because at the end of the day, the key component of stabilization is economic development that lasts. And I think, coming from the Department of Defense person, that is the key to further normalizing our relationship and getting to a place where we are not so dependent on U.S. military support.